kicked out of her home and completely shattered by a profound human betrayal. She bought a ruined, forgotten honey house deep in the isolated hills for exactly $10. But what she found permanently sealed inside a massive copper bee smoker changed everything. The heavy wooden door of the apartment slammed shut with a violent, deeply final crack that echoed loudly down the cheap, filthy linoleum hallway. 20-year-old Harper stood entirely still on the worn carpet, clutching a heavily duct-taped canvas duffel bag tightly to her thin chest. She was completely, utterly numb. The intense, highly painful screaming argument had finally ended, leaving behind a massive, incredibly destructive silence. The people she had deeply loved, the people she had completely trusted with her absolute survival, had fiercely turned against her, stripping her of her home and her last remaining shred of human faith in a single brutal afternoon. She walked slowly down the dark, incredibly narrow stairwell and stepped out into the freezing, pouring rain of the massive, indifferent city. She did not look back up at the third-floor window. She threw her heavy canvas bag into the back seat of her completely rusted, deeply failing, high Subaru Outback. The heavy engine cranked with a loud, aggressive mechanical whine before finally settling into a rough, highly erratic idle. Harper gripped the cracked plastic steering wheel. She felt a deep, profound, intensely physical aversion to the massive city surrounding her. She violently hated the dense crowds, the loud, aggressive traffic, and the constant, deeply exhausting friction of human interaction. The profound betrayal had completely severed her fragile connection to the world. She did not want to find another cheap apartment. She did not want to aggressively beg friends for a warm couch. She wanted absolute, complete, impenetrable isolation. She wanted to disappear so deeply into the dark woods that no human voice could ever reach her again. She drove aggressively away from the towering concrete skyline, following the heavy grey ribbons of wet asphalt as they snaked away from the massive urban centre. She drove for 8 incredibly long, completely silent hours, her dark eyes completely fixed on the hypnotic, rapid rhythm of the broken windshield wipers. She climbed higher and higher into the remote, heavily forested Appalachian Mountains, leaving the loud, crowded valleys completely behind. She finally pulled into a dying, severely depressed coal town that consisted of exactly one flashing yellow traffic light, a heavily rusted gas station, and a small, crumbling brick municipal building. The heavy rain had stopped, replaced by a dense, incredibly thick mountain fog that clung heavily to the dark pine trees. Harper pushed open the heavy glass doors of the county tax office. The small room was incredibly quiet, smelling intensely of old paper and stale coffee. An older man with deep, heavy lines etched permanently into his tired face sat behind a scratched wooden counter. He looked up, his eyes widening slightly at the incredibly pale, deeply exhausted 20-year-old girl standing dripping wet in his quiet lobby. "Mort need to buy a piece of deeply isolated property," Harper said, her voice incredibly hoarse, raw from the cold and the long terrible silence. "Mort don't care if the heavy roof is completely collapsed. Mort don't care if there is absolutely no running water. It just has to be incredibly far away from any other human being, and it has to be incredibly cheap." The old clerk stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He recognized the deeply terrified, highly aggressive defensive posture. He had seen entirely broken people retreat into these massive dark hills before. He slowly pulled a thick, heavy leather binder from beneath the scarred counter and opened it to a heavily yellowed, deeply curled page. "The most completely isolated property in this entire county is sitting on top of Blackwood Ridge," the clerk said quietly, pointing a thick, calloused finger at a faded topographical map. "It's an old, completely abandoned commercial apiary, a heavy timber honey house. The extraction facility has been entirely rotting in the deep mud since the late 80s. The dirt road up the steep mountain is completely washed out. The heavy timber roof is severely compromised. The opening bid on the heavy tax lien has been exactly $10 for over a decade. Nobody wants to fight that steep, terrifying mountain for a ruined wooden box. Harper reached her trembling, pale hand deep into her wet denim pocket. She pulled out a completely crumpled $10 bill. It was almost exactly half of her entire remaining net worth. She slammed the damp green paper flat onto the heavily scarred wooden counter. "Mortluk take it," she said fiercely, her dark eyes completely unyielding. "Give me the heavy deed." The clerk sighed, a sound of profound, deep administrative resignation. He quickly processed the heavy legal forms, heavily stamping the thick paper with a loud, aggressive thud. He slid a heavy, deeply rusted iron padlock key across the scratched wood. "You own the heavy liability now, miss," he warned quietly. "Be incredibly careful up there. The deep woods do not care if you are starving, and the heavy winter is coming very fast." Harper walked out of the warm building holding the heavy deed and the rusted key. She felt no massive surge of profound joy, only a deep, incredibly heavy sense of absolute finality. She climbed back into her failing rusted car and drove aggressively toward the massive dark shape of Blackwood Ridge, entirely ready to lock herself completely away from the cruel, loud world forever. The drive up the massive, incredibly steep incline of Blackwood Ridge was a terrifying, deeply punishing physical assault on Harper's failing, deeply rusted Subaru. The so-called road was absolutely nothing more than a highly aggressive, violently washed-out dirt track heavily choked with deep, thick mud, massive, jagged granite rocks, and the heavy, rotting trunks of fallen pine trees. The heavy car screamed in protest, its old transmission whining loudly as the bald tires spun violently, aggressively fighting for traction in the deep, wet. Harper gripped the vibrating steering wheel with white, heavily strained knuckles, throwing the heavy vehicle aggressively over deep, terrifying ruts that threatened to completely tear the rusted oil pan right off the bottom of the engine. She did not stop. She pushed the dying machine higher and deeper into the dense, completely silent forest until the thick, dark trees completely swallowed the grey light of the afternoon sky. Finally, after an incredibly exhausting, brutal hour of violent vertical climbing, the narrow dirt track abruptly ended in a small, heavily overgrown clearing. The heavy car sputtered violently and died, the overheated engine ticking loudly in the profound, heavy mountain silence. Harper pushed the heavy steel door open and stepped out into the freezing, incredibly thick mountain fog. She was entirely surrounded by massive, towering dark pines, completely cutting off any possible view of the deep valley below. She had achieved her absolute, desperate goal. The isolation was profound, total, and incredibly impenetrable. She turned to face her new massive property. Standing in the absolute center of the dark clearing, deeply suffocated by a massive sea of highly aggressive, thorny wild blackberry brambles and thick, twisting poison ivy, was the ruined honey house. It was a surprisingly large, heavily built structure, constructed entirely from massive, rough-hewn cedar logs and incredibly thick, rough-sawn timber planks. The building had been explicitly designed to handle the massive, incredible weight of heavy industrial honey extraction equipment and thousands of pounds of dense liquid gold. But decades of severe, deeply aggressive mountain winters had taken a massive, brutal toll. The heavy timber roof sagged violently in the center, heavily covered in thick, dark green moss and aggressively rotting wet leaves. The heavy wooden window shutters were completely blown off their rusted iron hinges, exposing the dark pitch-black interior to the freezing wind. Harper walked slowly through the chest-high, incredibly thick briars, the sharp thorns aggressively tearing at her thin jeans and scratching her pale hands. She reached the massive, heavy front door of the timber building. It was built from incredibly thick, solid oak planks secured by a massive, heavy iron padlock that was completely fused shut with decades of deep, dark orange corrosion. She did not even attempt to use the heavy, rusted key the clerk had given her. She walked back to the dead Subaru, pulled a massive, incredibly heavy steel tire iron from the messy trunk, and marched aggressively back to the heavy timber door. She wedged the flat, sharp steel tip of the heavy iron bar deeply into the tight gap between the rusted padlock and the heavy iron hasp. She threw her entire, incredibly thin body weight backward, prying with desperate, violent force. With a loud, incredibly sharp metallic snap that echoed violently through the silent, foggy clearing, the heavy, rusted internal pins of the old padlock shattered completely. The massive lock fell heavily into the thick mud. Harper dropped the heavy tire iron, grabbed the cold, rough iron handle, and pushed the heavy oak door completely open. The immediate, incredibly complex smell of the dark interior rushed out into the cold mountain air, hitting her with an absolute profound physical force. Unlike the sharp, terrifying scent of dry rot and dead decay that usually dominated abandoned ruins, the heavy timber honey house smelled incredibly rich, deeply sweet, and profoundly preserved. The heavy air was intensely saturated with the distinct, unmistakable aroma of ancient, highly crystallized raw honey, deeply fragrant, spicy propolis, and the massive, heavy scent of highly aged beeswax completely fused into the thick wooden floorboard. It smelled exactly like the absolute, beating heart of a massive, ancient hive. Harper pulled a weak, Sehatia pair plastic flashlight from her canvas jacket and clicked it on. She stepped slowly over the heavy timber threshold, her wet boots completely silent on the thick, heavily waxed wooden floor. She swept the weak yellow beam into the massive, pitch-black room. The interior was a terrifying, incredibly complex graveyard of heavy, abandoned industrial apiary equipment. The massive long room was heavily lined with incredibly tall, dark wooden shelving units, sagging violently under the massive weight of hundreds of empty, highly intricate wooden bee supers and thousands of delicate wooden frames. But dominating the absolute center of the heavy timber room, bolted entirely through the massive floorboards with thick steel bolts, was an incredibly large, deeply terrifying piece of heavy machinery. It was a massive, commercial-grade radial honey extractor. The massive, gleaming stainless steel drum was over 5 feet in diameter, designed specifically to violently spin dozens of heavy, wax-filled frames simultaneously using a massive, heavily geared hand crank. The massive machine stood completely silent in the deep shadows, an imposing, gleaming silver monolith completely frozen in. Harper walked slowly toward the massive steel drum, her weak flashlight beam bouncing off the cold, curved metal. The profound, heavy silence of the massive timber room pressed deeply against her ears. She was completely alone, miles from any aggressive, cruel human voice, surrounded entirely by the heavy, sweet scent of dead bees. She had deliberately sought out this absolute, freezing isolation, completely convinced that extreme loneliness was vastly preferable to the agonizing pain of deep human betrayal. But as she stood shivering in the dark, massive room, the incredibly heavy, crushing weight of her complete solitude settled deeply into her thin bones, terrifying and absolutely absolute. The first brutal, terrifying night inside the ruined timber honey house was an absolute punishing trial of freezing physical endurance. As the thick mountain fog outside slowly darkened into a completely pitch-black, incredibly aggressive night, the temperature inside the massive, uninsulated wooden building plummeted violently. Harper retreated to a small, heavily recessed corner near the back wall, entirely terrified of the massive, looming silhouette of the giant steel extractor dominating the center of the dark room. She laid out several large, heavy pieces of deeply dry, incredibly stiff cardboard she had ripped from old, collapsing shipping boxes. She unrolled her highly inadequate, thin synthetic sleeping bag, wrapped herself tightly in a completely damp, heavily worn canvas jacket, and curled into a tight, miserable ball on the hard wooden floor. The massive, highly porous timber walls did almost absolutely nothing to stop the aggressive, biting mountain wind from whistling loudly through the deep cracks, completely cutting through her thin clothes and chilling her deep into her exhausted bones. She lay awake for incredibly long, agonizing hours, her teeth chattering with a loud, violent, entirely uncontrollable rhythm. The incredibly profound, massive silence of the isolated mountain was deeply unnatural to a girl who had spent her entire young life completely surrounded by the deafening, constant noise of the crowded city. Every single sudden, sharp crack of a settling timber rafter, or the loud, heavy rustle of a wild animal moving aggressively through the thick brush outside, sent a massive, terrifying spike of pure adrenaline directly into her hammering heart. She squeezed her dark eyes tightly shut, fiercely, trying to completely block out the terrifying, heavy isolation. But the profound, crushing loneliness aggressively amplified the deep, agonizing pain of the brutal betrayal she had just suffered. The people she had completely trusted had actively, violently thrown her out into the cold, absolutely indifferent to her massive suffering. She fiercely convinced herself that the freezing, terrifying dark of the ruined honey house was completely necessary. It was a massive, highly protective shield. She would entirely freeze to death before she ever trusted another human being again. When the weak, incredibly grey dawn finally broke through the dense, heavy mountain fog, Harper forced her incredibly stiff, painfully cramped body up from the cold floor. Her entire thin frame ached with profound, heavy exhaustion. She walked slowly to the massive open window frame and looked out into the highly overgrown clearing. The heavy, dark pine trees were completely shrouded in thick, swirling white mist. She was entirely cut off from the massive world below. Her immediate, highly desperate priority was securing basic physical warmth and clean drinking water. The heavy timber honey house had absolutely no electricity and no functional plumbing. She grabbed a large, heavily rusted metal bucket she had found near the massive extractor and walked out into the freezing, damp clearing. She spent an incredibly exhausting, brutal hour aggressively fighting her way through the thick, terrifying wall of wild blackberry brambles, the sharp thorns violently tearing through her thin jeans and heavily scratching her pale hands. She finally located a small, highly active mountain spring aggressively bubbling from a jagged crack in a massive granite boulder. The water was incredibly clear, freezing cold, and perfectly pure. She filled the heavy metal bucket and hauled it back through the massive thorns, her weak arms burning with deep, heavy fatigue. To create a massive life-saving fire, she desperately needed dry fuel. She used the heavy steel tire iron to aggressively smash several highly rotted, completely useless wooden bee supers into small, jagged splinters. She cleared a small, safe circle on the thick wooden floor near the massive open window, deliberately ignoring the massive fire risk. She arranged the dry, brittle wood, struck a cheap paper match with her trembling, freezing fingers, and aggressively nursed the tiny, fragile yellow flame until it roared into a highly intense, bright orange fire. The immediate, incredibly powerful blast of raw, intense heat radiating from the small fire was the absolute most glorious, profoundly comforting physical sensation she had experienced in days. She huddled incredibly close to the dancing flames, extending her pale, heavily scratched hands directly toward the intense heat. She heated a small, heavily dented tin cup of the clear mountain water, drinking it slowly to completely thaw her freezing throat and deeply calm her painfully cramping empty stomach. As the small, highly aggressive fire slowly pushed the terrible, biting cold completely out of the small corner, Harper finally felt her violently trembling muscles begin to slowly relax. She looked out into the massive, incredibly long room, her dark eyes slowly adjusting to the weak grey light filtering through the open windows. The heavy, highly pervasive smell of ancient beeswax and spicy propolis was incredibly strong near the warm fire. She realized with profound absolute clarity that she could not simply sit huddled in the freezing dark corner waiting to completely starve to death. The massive, heavy timber building was her entire world now. She needed to completely secure the massive space, aggressively seal the heavy drafts, and heavily organize the chaotic, deeply terrifying graveyard of abandoned industrial equipment. She stood up slowly from the warm fire, completely ready to aggressively confront the massive, silent ruins of the forgotten apiary. Massive, exhausting physical labor of entirely clearing the ruined honey house began the very next morning. Harper tied her dark hair back with a torn piece of canvas and aggressively tackled the terrifying, chaotic graveyard of abandoned wooden bee equipment. The incredibly long room was heavily lined with incredibly tall, dark wooden shelving units that were completely packed with hundreds of old, deeply decaying wooden supers, the square wooden boxes used to hold the honeycomb frames. She grabbed the first heavy wooden box and yanked it violently from the high shelf. It was incredibly heavy, completely filled with thick, dark cobwebs, dead mice, and heavily crystallized, deeply hardened ancient honey that had completely glued the delicate wooden frames entirely together. She hauled the massive, heavy box out the front door and threw it aggressively into the thick mud of the clearing. For the next 4 entirely grueling, incredibly punishing days, she did absolutely nothing but aggressively haul heavy, rotting wood out of the massive building. The sheer physical exertion was deeply terrifying for a young girl running entirely on the meager calories of a single box of stale crackers and freezing mountain water. Her thin arms burned with profound, heavy fatigue, her pale hands were completely covered in deep, painful splinters, and her back ached with a massive, dull agony. But the brutal, intense physical labor provided an incredibly effective, highly necessary distraction from the agonizing, deeply sharp pain of her recent betrayal. Whenever the crushing, terrifying memories of the people who had violently abandoned her threatened to completely overwhelm her exhausted mind, she would aggressively grab another incredibly heavy, wax-filled box and throw it violently into the massive, growing pile in the clearing. She was fiercely determined to completely empty the heavy timber room, aggressively stripping the massive building down to its absolute bare wooden bones. By the late afternoon of the incredibly exhausting 4th day, the massive, long room was entirely clear of the heavy wooden debris. The massive, beautiful timber floorboards, deeply stained with decades of dark, fragrant propolis, were completely exposed. The incredibly large, terrifying stainless steel honey extractor finally stood entirely alone in the absolute center of the vast, highly organized space. Harper grabbed a stiff, heavily worn broom she had found in a dark corner and began aggressively sweeping the thick, heavy layer of grey dust and dead insects toward the heavy front door. As she swept vigorously beneath a massive, incredibly heavy oak workbench deeply bolted to the far back wall, her broom struck a heavy, solid object hidden entirely in the deep shadows. The impact produced a loud, incredibly dense metallic clang that echoed sharply in the completely empty room. She dropped the heavy broom and dropped to her sore knees on the hard floor. She reached her calloused hands deep into the dark, dusty space beneath the heavy bench. Her fingers closed around a massive, incredibly heavy cylindrical object. She gripped it firmly and pulled it aggressively out into the weak grey light of the open window. It was a massive, antique bee smoker, entirely constructed from thick, incredibly heavy solid copper. The heavy tool was explicitly designed to burn dry wood chips or pine needles, using an attached leather bellows to aggressively pump thick, cool smoke directly into a beehive to deeply calm the aggressive guard bee. This specific copper smoker was significantly larger and far heavier than any standard model, standing almost 2 feet tall. The incredibly thick copper was completely black with decades of heavy tarnish and deeply baked on smoke. But as Harper ran her dirty hands over the heavy metal cylinder, she immediately noticed a profound, highly unusual anomaly. The domed copper lid of a standard bee smoker was simply attached with a loose, simple metal hinge designed to be easily popped open with a single thumb to quickly add more burning fuel. The The domed lid of this massive copper smoker had absolutely no hinge. It had been aggressively permanently sealed completely shut. A massive, incredibly thick bead of heavy, dull grey lid solder ran entirely around the entire circumference of the heavy lid, completely fusing it permanently to the massive copper cylinder. It was explicitly fiercely designed to be an absolute impenetrable. Harper gripped the massive copper smoker veikepiti heart both hands and lifted it slightly from the heavy timber floor. It was incredibly, terrifyingly heavy, weighing easily over 40 pounds. She shook the heavy cylinder aggressively. It did not produce the light, dry rustling sound of old charcoal or dead wood chips. It produced a massive, incredibly dense, highly satisfying clinking sound. The distinct, heavy sound of massive solid metal objects violently striking Iaseha other inside the dark copper vault. Her breath completely stopped in her freezing throat. Her heart began to hammer a rapid, incredibly aggressive rhythm against her thin rib. She was standing entirely alone in a massive, deeply isolated, ruined timber building on top of a freezing mountain, completely starving to death, holding an incredibly heavy, permanently sealed copper vault that clearly contained absolutely no wood chips. The incredibly deep, profound isolation of the dark woods suddenly felt incredibly charged with a massive, highly dangerous secret. Driven by an intense, highly desperate curiosity that completely overrode her deep, agonizing physical exhaustion, Harper aggressively searched the massive, heavy oak workbench for a heavy tool capable of breaching the massive, highly secure lead seal. She violently pulled open the heavy, sticking wooden drawers. She found heavily rusted, hived, old, brittle leather gloves and thick blocks of hardened yellow beeswax, but absolutely no heavy metal files or chisels. She aggressively ran outside to her dead, deeply rusted Subaru. She violently popped the heavy steel trunk and grabbed the massive, incredibly heavy steel tire iron she had used to completely shatter the heavy iron padlock on the front door. She marched aggressively back into the massive timber room, her dark eyes completely fixed on the heavy, completely black copper cylinder resting silently on the thick floorboard. She sat heavily on the hard wooden floor, completely trapping the massive, incredibly heavy copper smoker tightly between her dirty boots. She positioned the flat, incredibly sharp wedge of the heavy steel tire iron directly against the incredibly thick bead of dull grey lead solder sealing the domed lid. She raised a heavily rusted, thick claw hammer, heart above her head with her trembling, pale hand. With a fierce, desperate grunt, she violently brought the heavy hammer down, striking the flat end of the tire iron with absolute, brutal force. Clang. The incredibly loud, sharp metallic impact echoed violently in the completely empty, massive room. The sharp steel tip of the heavy iron bar bit aggressively into the thick, relatively soft lead solder, gouging a deep, bright silver mark into the dull grey metal. She struck it again. Clang. And again. Clang. For 3 incredibly grueling, completely agonizing hours, Harper aggressively attacked the heavy lead seal. Her thin arms burned with an intense, paralyzing fire. Her highly calloused hands were completely covered in dark, heavy bruises and deep, bleeding blisters from the violent friction of the heavy hammer hand. She heavily chipped the thick lead away in small, tiny metallic flakes, aggressively working her way entirely around the massive, heavy circumference of the thick copper. Finally, with one last, incredibly violent, desperate blow, the heavy steel wedge broke completely through the final section of the heavy lead seal. The tight, completely airtight vacuum inside the massive copper cylinder was violently broken with a sharp, highly audible hiss. Harper dropped the incredibly heavy hammer onto the wooden floor. She gripped the massive, deeply tarnished copper dome, veikepitehat, both heavily bleeding hands, and violently ripped it completely off the heavy cylinder. She aimed the weak, incredibly dim yellow beam of her Zehatiya plastic flashlight directly down into the dark. Massive opening of the heavy copper smoker. The interior was not filled with massive heavy stacks of crisp paper money. The extreme, highly pervasive dampness of the deeply isolated mountain environment would have completely reduced fragile paper currency to a rotting, completely useless pulp of dead mold within a single decade. The person who had aggressively sealed this massive copper vault deeply understood the brutal, unforgiving environment. Sitting securely at the absolute bottom of the heavy copper cylinder were 5 incredibly thick, tightly drawn bags made of heavily oiled, dark brown leather. The thick, highly protective leather was completely impervious to the aggressive mountain moisture. Harper reached her violently trembling hand directly into the cold, dark copper cylinder. She grabbed the thick, heavy leather drawstring of the top bag and pulled it aggressively out into the weak grey light. The small leather bag was incredibly, terrifyingly heavy in her thin hands, weighing nearly 10 pounds. She untied the thick, incredibly stiff leather knot with her freezing, deeply bleeding fingers. She completely opened the dark opening of the heavy bag and tilted it carefully toward the weak flashlight beam. A massive, incredibly brilliant cascade of pure, highly polished gold instantly caught the dim light, throwing a blinding, fiercely bright yellow reflection directly into her wide, completely terrified dark eyes. The heavy leather bag was entirely filled with incredibly massive, flawless, solid gold coins. They were absolutely pristine, completely untouched by the heavy tarnish that coated the massive copper exterior. She reached her trembling fingers directly into the thick bag and pulled out one of the massive, incredibly heavy coins. The cold, dense metal felt absolutely staggering in her pale hand. The beautiful, highly detailed engraving was flawless. It was a 1-ounce American gold eagle, completely uncirculated and absolutely pristine. Harper completely stopped breathing. The freezing, heavy mountain air entirely vanished from her tight lungs. She aggressively pulled the other 4 incredibly heavy leather bags out of the massive copper smoker, dumping the heavy, brilliant gold coins directly onto the thick wooden floorboard. The massive, incredibly heavy pile of pure gold gleamed violently against the dark wood. She rapidly counted the massive heavy coins with a fierce frantic desperation, her dry lips moving entirely silently. There were exactly 500 incredibly massive, pure 1-ounce gold coins sitting heavily on the dirty floor. At the current, highly elevated market price, the massive, staggering pile of pure gold was easily worth well over $50,000. Harper fell completely backward against the heavy, solid oak workbench. A massive, incredibly violent shudder ripped entirely through her exhausted, severely starving body. She was a 20-year-old girl who had been violently, completely betrayed and permanently thrown out of her home just days ago. She had driven aggressively into the absolute, terrifying isolation of a freezing mountain to completely disappear and die alone. She had bought the entirely ruined, severely condemned building for exactly 10 crumpled dollars. And now completely surrounded by miles of dark, isolated forest, she possessed a massive, highly portable, absolutely staggering fortune in pure, incredibly heavy gold. Harper stared blindly at the incredibly massive, fiercely brilliant pile of heavy gold coins scattered aggressively across the dark, propolis-stained wooden floorboard. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the sudden, completely staggering wealth violently shattered her incredibly rigid, highly desperate survival instincts. She did not immediately feel a massive surge of profound joy or deep relief. She felt a deep, intensely terrifying surge of pure, raw panic. The heavy gold was a massive, highly dangerous secret. It completely destroyed the absolute, deeply safe isolation she had so aggressively sought on the freezing mountain. Her violently trembling hands moved incredibly slowly back toward the dark, empty opening of the massive copper smoke. She felt absolutely certain the heavy vault was completely empty, but her pale fingers brushed against something completely different, resting entirely flat at the absolute bottom of the heavy copper cylinder. It was a thick, incredibly dense object wrapped entirely in heavy, dark waterproof canvas. She carefully pulled it completely out of the heavy copper vault and aggressively unwrapped the protective canvas covering. It was a massive, incredibly thick notebook bound entirely in heavy, highly scarred dark brown leather. The heavy, thick pages were slightly warped from decades of extreme mountain humidity, but the incredibly durable leather cover had completely protected the fragile interior. Harper opened the heavy, thick cover. The heavy yellowed paper was completely covered in incredibly dense, highly precise, tightly written black ink. It was a highly detailed, incredibly complex beekeeper's diary. The massive, thick pages were entirely filled with highly precise, methodical records of heavy honey yields, incredibly complex notes on aggressive swarm behavior, and detailed, highly technical weather observations tracking brutal, freezing mountain winters spanning over 30 completely unbroken years. Harper turned the incredibly fragile pages incredibly slowly, the weak dying yellow beam of her small flashlight illuminating the heavy faded black ink. As she reached the final, incredibly thick pages of the massive leather book, the highly clinical, precise technical observations completely stopped. The handwriting abruptly changed, becoming incredibly large, fiercely aggressive, and deeply, violently emotional. She leaned incredibly close to the weak light, her dark eyes rapidly scanning the final, heavy words left entirely behind by the unknown, deeply isolated mountain beekeeper. The incredibly greedy corporate agricultural conglomerates have aggressively destroyed the entire valley below. They are violently spraying the fields with incredibly heavy, highly toxic pesticides that completely decimate the delicate, vital foraging line. My beautiful, highly productive hives are completely starving to death. The massive, deafening noise of their heavy machines is driving the terrified bees entirely mad. Mort cannot completely fight massive billion-dollar corporations with a simple, quiet copper smoker. Harper traced the heavy, faded black ink with her dirty, entirely calloused fingers. The profound, incredibly deep, agonizing heartbreak of the old, completely defeated beekeeper radiated fiercely from the heavy paper, instantly echoing the profound, massive betrayal she had violently suffered in the loud, cruel city. Mottom aggressively liquidating my entire massive life savings into highly portable, completely permanent solid gold. Mott absolutely refused to leave it in the massive greedy banks that fund the toxic destruction. Mott am permanently sealing the heavy gold entirely inside the massive copper smoker. Mott am completely abandoning the heavy timber honey house to the wild mountain. Harper swallowed hard, her completely dry throat aching violently. She looked directly at the final, heavily underlined, fiercely aggressive paragraph on the thick, yellowed page. If you have completely broken the heavy lead seal, you are standing entirely alone in the massive freezing timber room. You are deeply searching for absolute isolation, exactly like Mott did. The massive gold belongs entirely to you now, but you must deeply understand the profound, beautiful truth of the hive. Bees can only survive the brutal freezing winter if they completely know how to aggressively cluster close entirely together in the dark. Complete, absolute isolation is certain death. Do not let the freezing mountain entirely freeze your deeply human heart. Rebuild the massive wooden boxes. Bring the gentle humming life completely back to the dead clearing. Harper sat completely frozen on the hard wooden floor. The incredibly weak, dim beam of her Zehati Ape plastic flashlight finally flickered aggressively and died completely, plunging the massive, ruined timber honey house into absolute, terrifying pitch-black darkness. She was completely alone in the freezing dark, entirely surrounded by $50,000 in solid gold and the profound, heavy legacy of a dead man who had completely understood the terrifying danger of absolute, impenetrable loneliness. Bees can only survive the winter if they know how to cluster close together. The profoundly beautiful, highly devastating truth of the master beekeeper's final words completely shattered her incredibly thick, highly defensive armor. She pulled her knees aggressively to her thin chest, burying her dirty face in her freezing hands, and finally, after weeks of entirely silent, terrifying stoicism, began to violently, uncontrollably sob in the pitch-black room. The weak, incredibly pale grey dawn finally broke through the dense, heavy mountain fog, slowly illuminating the massive, freezing interior of the timber honey house. Harper woke up on the hard wooden floor, completely exhausted, her dark eyes heavily swollen from crying intensely in the pitch-black darkness. She pushed herself up, her stiff muscles screaming in profound, heavy agony. The massive, brilliant pile of pure gold coins was still scattered aggressively across the dark wood, a terrifying, highly solid reality. She moved with rapid, highly focused, incredibly paranoid energy. She quickly swept the massive, heavy coins back into the thick leather bags, tying the stiff drawstrings into incredibly tight, heavy knots. She needed an absolutely secure, highly impenetrable vault to hide the massive fortune. She carried the heavy bags to the incredibly large, massive stainless steel honey extractor, dominating the center of the room. She dropped the heavy gold deep into the dark, sticky interior of the massive steel drum, closing the heavy latching metal lid. It was the absolute perfect hiding spot. She took exactly one single massive gold coin and slipped it deeply into the front pocket of her dirty, torn jeans. She walked out of the heavy timber building, climbed into her completely dead, rusted Subaru and prayed fiercely. Miraculously, the heavy engine cranked violently and roared to life. She drove the heavily damaged car incredibly slowly and aggressively down the terrifying washed-out dirt track, sliding dangerously through the deep mud until she finally hit the solid, safe asphalt of the county. She did not stop in the dying small coal town. She drove aggressively for 3 incredibly long, highly tense hours, heading directly toward the nearest massive, densely populated city. She parked the rusted car near a highly secure, heavily barred storefront with a bright, aggressive neon sign reading Commercial Gold and Silver Exchange. Harper walked incredibly cautiously into the bright, heavily sterile lobby. The large, intimidating dealer behind the thick, bulletproof glass looked incredibly skeptically at her filthy clothes and entirely unwashed dark hair. But when she pushed the massive, flawless, uncirculated 1-ounce American Gold Eagle through the narrow metal slot, his entirely dismissive demeanor instantly, completely vanished. "This is incredibly pristine," the dealer said, his voice dropping to a highly respectful, hushed tone. "Mort can offer you exactly $2,100 in crisp, untraceable cash right now." Harper simply nodded, her dark eyes completely hard and entirely unyielding. 10 minutes later, she walked out of the heavily secure exchange with a thick, massive envelope of crisp $100 bills safely hidden inside her canvas jacket. She immediately drove aggressively to a massive commercial-grade hardware and survival outfitter on the edge of the large city. She moved rapidly and fiercely through the bright aisles, loading 2 massive metal carts with absolutely vital, heavy-duty survival gear. She bought an incredibly massive, highly efficient cast-iron wood stove, thick sections of heavy black stovepipe, dense rolls of high-grade fiberglass insulation, heavy-duty roofing tar, massive boxes of thick steel nails, and a powerful high-output chainsaw. She completely filled the entire rusted trunk of the heavy Subaru Verkepite hat, massive amounts of dense, non-perishable, high-calorie food, heavy wool winter clothing, and thick, sub-zero rated sleeping bags. The sheer, overwhelming physical relief of possessing massive, heavy stacks of protective cash completely eradicated her agonizing, desperate starvation. She had successfully traded a single, cold piece of gold for absolute, incredibly solid physical security. When she finally pushed the heavily overloaded, deeply sagging car back up the terrifying steep Mountain Day route track, the freezing sun was already dropping rapidly behind the dark pine trees. She aggressively hauled the incredibly heavy cast-iron wood stove into the massive timber honey house, dragging it completely across the thick wooden floorboard. She spent the entire freezing night aggressively installing the heavy black stovepipe through a pre-existing hole in the thick timber roof, explicitly ignoring her profound, heavy exhaustion. When she finally struck a match and lit the thick, dry split logs inside the massive iron stove, the resulting aggressive blast of incredibly intense, deeply radiant heat was absolutely breathtaking. The massive cast-iron stove roared aggressively, rapidly pushing the terrible, biting, paralyzing cold entirely out of the massive timber room. Harper stripped off her freezing, soaked canvas jacket. She sat heavily in front of the roaring, bright orange fire, eating a massive, heavy tin of hot beef stew. She was no longer a desperate, starving, entirely broken girl running blindly from a massive betrayal. She was heavily armed, entirely warm, and deeply fortified against the coming. The massive, incredibly brutal physical transformation of the ruined timber honey house aggressively consumed the next 3 grueling weeks. Harper fell into a highly intense, deeply solitary, punishing routine governed entirely by the rapidly shrinking daylight hours and the aggressively plunging mountain temperatures. The heavy, dark woods around the clearing grew completely silent as the freezing winter rapidly approached, pressing heavily against the massive wooden wall. She started aggressively with the severely compromised, massively sagging heavy timber roof. She hauled thick, incredibly heavy rolls of heavy-duty roofing membrane up an incredibly unstable, highly rusted aluminum ladder. The sheer terrifying physical exertion of wrestling the massive, heavy rolls into position on the steep, dangerously slippery pitch was intensely exhausting. She aggressively coated the heavy seams with thick, incredibly sticky black roofing tar, permanently sealing the massive structure against the incredibly aggressive, violent winter rainstorms that constantly lashed the isolated mountain. Inside the massive long room, she tackled the incredibly terrifying, deeply biting drafts. The heavy, rough-sawn cedar logs had significantly shrunk over the long decades, leaving massive, incredibly wide gaps that allowed the freezing wind to aggressively slice directly into the warm room. Harper spent endless, incredibly tedious hours aggressively pounding incredibly thick, heavily oiled rope deep into the massive wooden cracks using a heavy wooden mallet and a blunt steel chisel. She aggressively lined the entire interior ceiling with thick, incredibly itchy rolls of pink fiberglass insulation, permanently trapping the intense, massive heat generated by the roaring cast-iron stove entirely inside the building. The massive timber honey house was no longer a rotting, incredibly freezing ruin slowly sinking into the deep mud. It was a massive, highly fortified, incredibly warm, entirely impenetrable wooden fortress. But as the heavy, completely dark winter aggressively settled over the isolated mountain, completely burying the steep dirt track in 3 incredibly deep, unnavigable feet of thick white snow, the profound, massive isolation she had aggressively sought began to deeply, heavily turn against her. Harper was entirely, completely trapped on the top of Blackwood Ridge. She was incredibly warm, entirely safe, and profoundly well fed, but the absolute, crushing lack of any human contact or external sound was incredibly, deeply suffocating. The massive, thick timber walls completely blocked out the loud, aggressive world, but they also entirely trapped her deeply inside her own highly traumatized, incredibly loud mind. The agonizing, sharp, painful memories of the massive betrayal she had violently suffered played on an aggressive, endless, terrifying loop in the deafening, quiet room. To keep herself from slipping entirely into a massive, deeply paralyzing depression, Harper turned aggressively to the incredibly thick, highly detailed leather-bound diary Le Aepte entirely behind by the dead master beekeeper. Every single freezing, dark night she sat incredibly close to the roaring, bright orange fire of the massive cast-iron stove. She slowly turned the heavy yellowed parchment pages, reading the incredibly dense, highly precise technical observations by the weak, steady light of a heavy kerosene lantern. She did not duet read about incredibly massive honey yields, or highly technical wooden hive construction. She read profoundly beautiful, deeply poetic observations about the incredible, highly complex, massively synchronized life of the superorganism. She learned exactly how a completely isolated single honeybee would entirely rapidly freeze to death in the brutal winter. She read how the incredibly massive, buzzing community aggressively clustered tightly together in the dark, violently vibrating their heavy wing muscles to generate an incredibly intense, massive shared heat that permanently kept the fragile queen entirely alive through the deepest, darkest freezes. Bees can only survive the winter if they know how to cluster close together. The master beekeeper's final, incredibly heavy words echoed loudly and fiercely in her isolated, quiet mind. Harper lowered the massive leather book, staring deeply into the incredibly intense, dancing orange flames. She realized with a profound, terrifying, incredibly absolute clarity that her aggressive, fierce attempt to completely sever all connection to the living world was entirely, profoundly wrong. The massive, heavy timber walls were keeping her completely warm, but the total, absolute isolation was slowly, aggressively freezing her deeply human heart. She could not entirely survive the massive winter completely alone in the dark. She looked across the warm, bright room at the completely clean, highly organized stacks of empty, incredibly complex wooden bee supers she had aggressively salvaged from the heavy rot. She made an incredibly fierce, completely unyielding, absolute decision. When the heavy, freezing snow finally melted, she was not going to aggressively run away to a massive, loud city with the hidden gold. She was going to completely fulfill the heavy, profound contract. She was going to aggressively bring the loud, vibrant, heavily buzzing life completely back to the dead, silent mountain clearing. When the aggressive, brutal, incredibly deep winter finally broke into a heavily damp, violently muddy spring, Harper aggressively swung into highly focused, entirely relentless action. The massive, incredibly steep dirt track leading down the dark mountain was completely impassable for her dead, rusted Subaru, but she did not care. She aggressively hiked the incredibly long, physically punishing 5 miles down the steep, heavily washed-out ridge, her heavy waterproof boots sinking deeply into the freezing mud. She carried exactly 3 massive, flawless gold coins safely hidden inside a small, deeply concealed pocket sewn tightly inside her heavy canvas jacket. She aggressively hitchhiked from the dying coal town completely out to the massive, sprawling agricultural valley miles away, explicitly seeking a highly reputable, massive commercial apiary supply company. She walked aggressively into the loud, incredibly busy commercial warehouse. She did not look like a highly desperate, completely broken homeless girl anymore. The brutal, punishing physical labor of the long, incredibly isolated winter had completely forged her into a fierce, heavily muscled, deeply confident woman. She aggressively slapped a massive, incredibly thick stack of crisp $100 bills, newly exchanged from the heavy gold, flat onto the main counter. Mort need exactly 20 completely established, highly populated, incredibly healthy nucleus colonies of Italian honeybees, Harper demanded firmly, her voice deeply resonant and entirely unyielding. Mort need 30 brand new, incredibly heavy-duty commercial wooden hive bodies, massive boxes of thick wax foundation, highly protective professional bee suits, and a brand new, massive stainless steel uncapping knife. The incredibly shocked warehouse manager aggressively scrambled to completely fulfill the massive, highly lucrative order. Harper fiercely negotiated the highly complex, incredibly difficult logistics of aggressively transporting the massively heavy, actively buzzing colonies completely up the incredibly steep, ruined dirt track of Blackwood Ridge, using an incredibly heavy-duty, rented four-wheel drive commercial flatbed truck. A week later, the incredibly massive, heavily loaded commercial truck roared aggressively up the terrifying mountain track, the massive, deeply lugged mud tires violently chewing through the thick, wet. The terrified driver aggressively backed the massive flatbed directly into the heavily cleared, sunny clearing in front of the massive timber honey house. Harper aggressively unloaded the massive, heavy wooden boxes entirely by herself, refusing any help from the nervous driver. The incredibly loud, highly aggressive, deeply vibrating hum of tens of thousands of deeply agitated, highly confined honeybees entirely filled the quiet mountain clearing. It was a massive, incredibly powerful sound of pure, concentrated, deeply aggressive life. She carefully arranged the 20 heavy, freshly painted white wooden hive bodies in a perfect, incredibly precise, highly calculated arc at the absolute edge of the sunny clearing, explicitly facing the warm, rising eastern sun exactly as the dead master beekeeper had fiercely instructed in his heavy leather diary. She wore the incredibly thick, highly protective white canvas bee suit, the heavy wire mesh veil completely covering her pale face. She aggressively lit the brand new standard tin bee smoker, pumping the heavy leather bellows until incredibly thick, cool, highly calming white smoke billowed aggressively from the metal spout. She absolutely refused to use the massive, ancient copper smoker. That heavy vault was permanently retired, securely hidden deep inside the massive stainless steel extractor. With incredibly slow, highly deliberate, completely fearless, steady hands, Harper aggressively cracked the heavily sealed wooden travel knucks open. She gently, precisely transferred the incredibly heavy, deeply comb-filled wooden frames, absolutely covered entirely with thousands of aggressively crawling, incredibly loud, vibrating bees, directly into their permanent, massive wooden homes. As she worked incredibly close to the massive, highly defensive swarms, she was not terrified. The incredibly loud, rhythmic, deeply resonant buzzing sound did not cause aggressive panic. It triggered a profound, incredibly deep, highly physical, calming effect, deep within her severely traumatized, completely isolated mind. The massive, incredibly synchronized, highly focused community was aggressively clustering together, completely organizing their new wooden home with fierce, absolute purpose. Bees can only survive the winter if they know how to cluster close together. Harper stood back from the massively active, heavily buzzing white box. Thousands of highly aggressive, incredibly fast worker bees were already launching entirely into the bright mountain air, aggressively seeking out the massive, blooming fields of wild mountain laurel and deep purple thistle entirely surrounding the massive timber honey house. The deep, terrifying, absolutely crushing isolation of the silent, forgotten mountain was completely, permanently shattered. The massive, heavily buzzing life had violently aggressively returned to the ruined dirt, and Harper was entirely, completely surrounded by her massive, fiercely protective new family. The massive, incredibly vibrant mountain spring exploded aggressively into a wildly hot, heavily blooming summer, entirely transforming the highly isolated ridge into a massive, completely overflowing ocean of deeply fragrant wild nectar. The 20 heavily populated, incredibly strong nucleus colonies that Harper had aggressively installed responded to the massive, overwhelming abundance of wild mountain flowers with an absolute, profoundly terrifying explosion of incredibly rapid reproduction and massive, heavy honey production. The small, white wooden boxes were no longer sufficient. Harper aggressively stacked massive, incredibly heavy wooden supers completely on top of the original hive bodies, rapidly building towering, incredibly tall wooden skyscrapers to explicitly contain the violently expanding, massively buzzing populations. The entire sunny clearing was entirely saturated with the incredibly loud, deeply resonant, highly rhythmic roar of over 1 million actively foraging honeybees aggressively vibrating the heavy summer air. Harper worked with an incredibly fierce, absolutely relentless physical intensity from the very first pale grey light of dawn until the deep, dark night aggressively completely fell. She wore the thick, highly protective white canvas bee suit completely soaked in heavy, exhausting sweat. She aggressively inspected the massive, incredibly heavy hives, expertly preventing highly disruptive swarms, heavily replacing fully capped, incredibly dense frames of pure honey with entirely empty, freshly waxed wooden frames, explicitly pushing the massive, highly focused superorganisms to aggressively produce even more. By the incredibly hot, aggressively humid peak of late July, the massive, towering wooden hives were completely full. Harper stood in the deeply buzzing clearing, staring in profound, absolute awe at the massive, incredible weight of the heavily capped honey aggressively bending the thick wooden stands. The massive, completely forgotten apiary was incredibly, fiercely alive, completely wildly exceeding any of her most highly desperate, deeply starving winter dreams. But the massive, incredibly heavy abundance completely presented a profound, highly physical problem. She could not manually uncap and entirely crush hundreds of incredibly heavy, highly dense wax frames completely by hand. She absolutely, desperately needed the massive, terrifying piece of heavy industrial machinery she had aggressively feared during her first freezing, terrifying night in the dark timber room. She walked aggressively into the cool, dark, massive honey house. The incredible, massive stainless steel radial extractor still dominated the absolute center of the heavily timbered floor, completely frozen in heavy time. The massive, deep interior of the shiny steel drum still completely hid the heavy leather bags entirely filled with $47,000 in pristine solid gold coins. Harper aggressively reached deep into the heavy steel drum and violently hauled the incredibly heavy leather bags completely out. She aggressively shoved the heavy, massive gold entirely under the incredibly scarred, thick oak workbench in the dark back corner. The heavy physical wealth was completely irrelevant right now. The true, absolute, heavily flowing liquid gold was waiting aggressively outside in the incredibly loud, heavily buzzing clearing. She completely disassembled the heavy, highly complex gearing mechanism of the massive hand crank. She aggressively scrubbed the heavy, thick layer of deeply hardened, ancient propolis and heavy dirt entirely from the incredibly large stainless steel drum using scalding hot water and a heavy bristle brush. She aggressively lubricated the complex, deeply precise heavy steel bearings with completely food-safe, highly pure mineral oil. She gripped the massive, incredibly heavy cast-iron hand crank and pushed aggressively downward. The incredibly large, highly complex internal steel cage slowly groaned, resisting slightly, and then aggressively, violently spun completely free. The massive heavy steel machinery operated with absolute, deeply satisfying, incredibly smooth, completely silent perfection. Bees can only survive the winter if they know how to cluster close together. The heavy, profound, deeply emotional truth echoed entirely through her completely focused, highly exhausted mind. The massive dead machinery was completely resurrected. The heavy timber honey house was completely aggressively ready to actively receive the massive, overwhelming harvest. Harper grabbed a heavy, brand-new steel uncapping knife and aggressively pushed the heavy wooden door completely open, stepping fiercely back out into the incredibly loud, heavily buzzing, entirely vibrant mountain sun. The massive, incredibly exhausting, profoundly heavy process of commercial honey extraction began with a fierce, absolute, highly rhythmic intensity. Harper aggressively wheeled a heavy solid wood cart completely loaded with incredibly heavy, completely full bee supers directly from the aggressively buzzing hives into the cool, dark interior of the massive timber honey house. She aggressively sealed the heavy oak door completely shut behind her, explicitly locking the highly aggressive, deeply agitated guard bees entirely outside in the hot mountain air. She stood at the massive, heavily scarred oak workbench. She pulled the incredibly heavy, completely wax-sealed wooden frames aggressively from the sticky boxes. The heavy, thick wooden frames weighed an incredibly massive 10 pounds each, completely bulging with incredibly dense, highly pure, absolutely perfect wild mountain honey. She plugged the heavy, brand-new electric uncapping knife into a massive, heavy-duty marine battery she had aggressively hauled completely up the steep mountain track. The sharp, heavy steel blade instantly hissed with intense, aggressive heat. She expertly slid the incredibly hot, completely sharp blade directly down the face of the heavy wooden frame, aggressively slicing completely through the incredibly thin, perfectly white wax cappings. The immediate, massive, incredibly overwhelming smell of raw, intensely sweet, deeply floral wild honey aggressively flooded the dark timber room, completely intoxicating and entirely overpowering. She rapidly transferred exactly 32 incredibly heavy, deeply dripping, completely uncapped frames directly into the highly complex, massive stainless steel cage of the giant radial extractor. The massive, perfectly balanced machine easily absorbed the incredibly heavy, massive weight. Harper gripped the massive, incredibly heavy cast iron hand crank. She planted her heavy, muddy boots firmly on the thick, heavily waxed wooden floorboards, bracing her incredibly strong, heavily muscled core. She pushed violently, aggressively forward. The massive, incredibly large steel cage began to slowly, heavily rotate inside the giant stainless steel drum. As she aggressively increased the massive physical effort, driving her highly exhausted muscles to their absolute, complete breaking point, the heavy steel cage violently accelerated into an incredibly rapid, completely blurring speed. The intense, highly aggressive centrifugal force violently ripped the incredibly dense, heavy liquid honey directly from the deep wax cells. The massive, incredibly loud sound of heavily raining honey violently striking the inside of the massive steel drum was absolutely deafening, deeply satisfying, and completely profoundly euphoric. She aggressively maintained the intense, massive physical spinning for exactly 10 completely grueling, incredibly exhausting minutes, entirely relying on her deeply forged, massive physical strength to keep the heavy machine rapidly roaring. When she finally entirely stopped aggressively pumping the heavy iron crank, the massive steel cage slowly spun completely down to absolute, deeply quiet stillness. Harper walked incredibly slowly to the absolute bottom of the massive stainless steel drum. She aggressively positioned a massive, perfectly clean 5-gallon white food-grade bucket directly beneath the heavy, highly polished, solid brass gate. She gripped the heavy brass handle and aggressively pulled it completely open. A massive, incredibly thick, highly unbroken river of absolute, pure, deeply golden liquid violently poured directly from the heavy machine. It was completely untouched by massive, toxic corporate chemicals, entirely unheated and perfectly, wildly raw. The incredibly massive, heavy bucket filled aggressively, completely, to the absolute brim in entirely under 2 minutes. Harper dipped her highly calloused, deeply scarred finger directly into the massive, heavy stream of pure liquid gold. She tasted it. The incredibly complex, deeply rich flavor of sharp mountain laurel, highly fragrant wild blackberry, and deep, dark pine completely exploded on her tongue. It was absolutely, profoundly, entirely flawless. Tears of absolute, complete, highly overwhelming physical and emotional triumph aggressively flooded her dark eyes. She had aggressively, completely survived the terrifying, deeply agonizing betrayal. She had entirely fiercely conquered the incredibly brutal, deeply isolating, freezing dark winter. She had aggressively utilized the heavy, highly hidden gold entirely as a powerful, massive tool of deep, profound resurrection, completely honoring the dead master's fierce, desperate legacy. The massive, heavily buzzing superorganism had completely, permanently saved her deeply broken life, aggressively turning her terrifying isolation into a massive, incredibly overflowing, highly sweet abundance. By the end of the incredibly intense, massively productive mountain summer, Harper had aggressively filled over 100 massive 5-gallon heavy plastic buckets with entirely pure, completely flawless wild honey. The heavy, completely staggering weight of the incredible harvest deeply threatened to aggressively crack the massive, thick floorboards of the heavy timber honey house. The massive, highly hidden gold was still completely secure beneath the heavy oak workbench, but Harper had aggressively generated a completely massive, entirely legitimate, incredibly heavy new fortune from the wildly blooming dirt. But the massive, incredible abundance immediately triggered a profound, highly terrifying new challenge. To completely sell the massive, heavy harvest, she absolutely had to aggressively leave the deeply isolated, highly protective safety of the remote mountain ridge. She had to aggressively re-enter the loud, incredibly chaotic, completely unpredictable human world that had violently, deeply betrayed her. She spent an incredibly tense, highly anxious week carefully pouring the heavy, thick honey into thousands of perfectly clean, heavy glass mason jars, aggressively sealing them with tight, highly secure metal lids. She aggressively loaded her deeply rusted, completely beaten-up Subaru Verkepite hat exactly 200 incredibly heavy glass jars. She drove incredibly slowly down the terrifying, massively steep dirt track, tightly gripping the heavy steering wheel, her heart hammering with a deep, paralyzing, highly aggressive panic. She drove completely past the dying, severely depressed coal town, driving directly to a massive, incredibly busy weekend farmer market located in a highly affluent, loudly bustling agricultural valley entirely 50 miles away. She aggressively rented a small, highly exposed wooden table near the absolute edge of the crowded, loud market. She meticulously stacked the incredibly beautiful, deeply glowing golden jars in massive, highly attractive pyramids. She sat rigidly behind the small table, her dark eyes completely wide, heavily defensive, and completely terrified of the loud, violently moving crowds. For the first completely agonizing hour, she entirely avoided all human eye contact. But slowly, the incredibly deep, highly complex, wildly unique color of the raw mountain honey began to aggressively attract massive attention. An older woman with incredibly kind, deeply crinkled eyes stopped aggressively at the small wooden table. Mott have never, ever seen completely raw honey with such an incredibly dark, deeply rich amber color, the woman said warmly, entirely ignoring Harper's rigid, highly defensive posture. Where exactly did your massive bees aggressively forage? Blackwood Ridge, Harper forced the quiet words past her incredibly tight, entirely terrified throat. It's completely isolated, highly overgrown, absolutely no corporate chemicals, only wild, heavy mountain laurel and deep pine. The woman aggressively bought 3 incredibly heavy glass jars. A massive, loud chef from a highly expensive local restaurant aggressively tasted a small, free sample and instantly, completely bought an entire massive case on the exact spot. By the extremely hot, highly exhausting early afternoon, the entire massive stack of 200 heavy glass jars was completely, entirely sold out. Harper had an incredibly thick, massive stack of crisp, completely legitimate $20 bills aggressively shoved deep into her canvas pockets. But far more incredibly important than the massive heavy cash was the profound, completely shocking realization that aggressively flooded her highly exhausted mind. The hundreds of complex, incredibly brief human interactions she had violently survived had not been entirely cruel, deeply manipulative, or completely betraying. They had been incredibly warm, highly appreciative, and deeply, genuinely respectful of her massive, brutal physical labor. Bees can only survive the winter if they know how to cluster close together. The profound, incredibly heavy truth violently shattered her incredibly thick, deeply defensive isolationist armor entirely into a million complete, tiny pieces. She could not entirely survive by fiercely hiding forever in a massive dark wooden box on a terrifying isolated mountain, no matter how much solid gold she deeply possessed. The massive, highly organized superorganism of the hive completely relied on incredibly complex, massive interaction to aggressively thrive. She desperately needed a massive, deeply supportive human hive to completely, permanently heal. She aggressively packed up her small wooden table, an incredibly fierce, entirely new, deeply hopeful determination completely setting into her strong, highly calloused bones. She was going completely back to the heavy timber honey house, but she was absolutely not going to completely hide it. The massive, incredibly successful Farmer S market aggressively triggered a highly profound, complete shift in Harper S' entirely isolated existence. When she finally drove the heavily rusted Subaru completely back down the terrifying, highly dangerous mountain track a few days later, she did not aggressively blow straight past the dying, severely depressed coal town at the absolute bottom of the heavy ridge. She parked the heavy car directly in front of the small, crumbling brick municipal building. The incredibly tired, heavily lined older clerk was still sitting entirely behind the deeply scarred wooden counter. He looked up, his eyes widening in massive, profound shock. The terrified, completely broken 20-year-old girl who had aggressively bought the ruined liability for $10 months ago was entirely gone. Standing before him was a highly confident, incredibly strong woman, her skin deeply tanned from the massive mountain sun, her hands thick with heavy, hard-earned calluses. Mott completely need to hire a massive, highly skilled commercial road crew, Harper stated firmly, entirely skipping any small talk. Mott need heavy bulldozers, massive graders, and hundreds of tons of crushed gravel. Mott ve kepa note to aggressively rebuild the entire 5-mile dirt track completely up Blackwood Ridge, and Mott want to explicitly hire the men directly from this completely struggling town. The old clerk stared at her in complete absolute disbelief. Miss, rebuilding that terrifying, washed-out mountain track will aggressively cost tens of thousands of dollars. This entire town is completely bankrupt. Nobody here has had a massive, steady paycheck from heavy machine work in over 5 agonizing years. Harper aggressively pulled a massive, incredibly thick stack of crisp $100 bills, entirely funded by selling another massive, flawless gold coin from the heavy copper smoker, and slapped it violently onto the deeply scarred wooden counter. "Start aggressively making the phone calls," she commanded fiercely. "Pay them incredibly well." The massive, heavy work completely starts tomorrow at the absolute crack of dawn. The incredible, highly explosive impact of the massive cash injection completely jolted the dying, silent town entirely back to aggressive, highly vocal life. Within exactly 24 hours, massive, incredibly heavy yellow bulldozers and giant roaring diesel graders were aggressively violently attacking the terrified, washed-out mountain track. Harper stood at the absolute top of the ridge, completely wrapped in a heavy canvas jacket, aggressively watching the massive, loud machines expertly carve a deeply secure, highly stable, perfectly graded commercial gravel road directly up the massive mountain. The aggressive, deafening mechanical roar was absolutely nothing like the terrifying, crushing noise of the cruel city she had violently fled. It was the incredibly beautiful, highly productive sound of massive, deeply necessary human collaboration. The heavy, exhausted local men operating the massive machines completely revered the incredibly tough young woman who was aggressively paying them in crisp, heavy cash at the end of every single grueling week. They completely recognized the fierce, absolute, unyielding grit in her dark eyes. She wasn't an incredibly wealthy, highly arrogant outsider, entirely exploiting their desperate poverty. She was aggressively using her massive hidden resources to entirely, deeply rebuild their completely shattered local economy. Bees can only survive the winter if they know how to cluster close together. Harper smiled fiercely as the massive heavy gravel trucks aggressively dumped the final perfectly crushed load at the absolute edge of the deeply buzzing mountain clearing. The terrifying, entirely impenetrable, completely absolute isolation of the ruined honey house was officially, permanently destroyed. She had aggressively built a massive, incredibly wide, completely open bridge directly back to the human world, deliberately inviting the completely broken, highly desperate town to aggressively share in the incredibly massive, heavily buzzing abundance she had violently pulled from the wild, dark dirt. With the massive, completely stable, newly graded gravel road aggressively ensuring highly secure, totally uninterrupted commercial access to the remote mountain ridge, Harper violently expanded the massive apiary operation entirely beyond her own singular, heavily exhausted physical capacity. The incredibly vibrant, wildly booming wild mountain ecosystem could completely support hundreds of massive, heavy colonies, but she absolutely could not manually manage that massive, terrifying scale entirely alone. She drove down the massive mountain and aggressively posted a simple, highly direct handwritten notice on the deeply scarred wooden bulletin board inside the town tiny struggling grocery store, heavy, highly demanding physical labor, incredibly high, steady cash pay, must not be completely terrified of massive loud bees. Within exactly 2 hours, 3 young people from the deeply depressed town were aggressively standing awkwardly in the buzzing mountain clearing. 2 incredibly strong, highly quiet brothers who had been completely laid off from the dying coal mines, and a fiercely determined 19-year-old girl who desperately needed heavy cash to completely escape an incredibly violent, toxic home. Harper did not simply aggressively throw them entirely into the terrifying, highly chaotic center of the massively buzzing hives. She completely understood the profound, deeply paralyzing terror of massive, loud, uncontrollable forces. She sat them down entirely on the thick wooden floorboards of the massive, highly secure timber honey house. She aggressively handed them the incredibly thick, heavily scarred leather diary L'Epte behind by the dead master beekeeper. "You must completely read this heavy book before you ever touch a single wooden frame," Harper commanded fiercely, her dark eyes entirely unyielding. "You must entirely understand the incredibly massive, highly complex, deeply synchronized superorganism. You cannot completely fight the massive bees with aggressive, violent panic. If you are entirely terrified and move violently, they will completely sense your terrifying adrenaline and aggressively attack. You must completely learn to move with incredibly slow, absolute, entirely calm, deeply deliberate purpose." For the first completely intense, highly exhausting week, she actively taught them the profound, incredibly difficult art of absolute, deep physical calmness entirely surrounded by massive, loud chaos. She made them stand entirely still in the massive, violently buzzing clearing without the highly protective, thick canvas bee suit. She aggressively forced them to deeply internalize the incredibly loud, heavily resonant vibration of millions of aggressively flying bees until the terrifying, deafening roar slowly transformed into a deeply calming, completely rhythmic, highly predictable hum. The profound, heavy discipline violently transformed the completely broken, highly desperate young workers. The 2 deeply exhausted, completely silent miners found absolute profound peace in the highly meticulous, deeply gentle, incredibly precise handling of the fragile wooden frame. The terrified 19-year-old girl completely stopped heavily flinching aggressively finding massive, unshakable confidence entirely in her new ability to highly calmly control massive, terrifying swarms of aggressive, stinging insects. They aggressively formed an incredibly tight, highly loyal, completely fiercely protective new family entirely around the heavy timber honey house. They completely ate hot, heavy meals together near the roaring cast-iron stove. They aggressively hauled thousands of incredibly heavy, perfectly full wooden supers completely into the dark timber room, completely sharing the massive, punishing physical burden that had nearly crushed Harper entirely alone the previous intense summer. Harper watched the deeply quiet, entirely synchronized teamwork from the heavy oak workbench. The incredibly massive, highly dark, tightly sealed copper smoker still sat silently completely under the heavy wood, holding the remaining $40,000 in pure solid gold. But the heavy physical metal wealth felt increasingly entirely irrelevant. She had aggressively used the massive hidden fortune exactly as the dying old man had fiercely demanded. She had not entirely run away with the greedy gold. She had completely resurrected the massive heavy timber house, entirely rebuilt the terrifying dirt road, and aggressively clustered closely together with deeply broken, highly desperate people entirely in the freezing dark. She had actively built a completely massive, entirely new, fiercely protective human hive, entirely ensuring that absolutely none of them would ever completely freeze to death in isolation again. By her incredibly fierce, highly productive third year on the completely isolated mountain ridge, the massive, fully restored timber honey house was an absolute roaring powerhouse of entirely legitimate, completely massive commercial agricultural production. The massive, deeply overgrown clearing was now entirely filled verkepte, hut exactly 300 perfectly aligned, freshly painted heavy white wooden hives, violently overflowing with completely thriving, massively powerful colonies. The heavy, totally grueling process of extraction was no longer entirely manual. Harper had aggressively utilized the highly steady, massive commercial income from the incredibly popular wild mountain honey, along with another highly discreet, completely silent liquidation of several heavy gold coins, to aggressively upgrade the massive timber facility. She hired the deeply grateful, highly skilled local town crew to aggressively build a massive, incredibly heavy timber extension entirely onto the back of the original ruined building. She entirely kept the beautiful, massive antique stainless steel radial hand crank extractor perfectly mounted in the absolute center of the main room, fiercely honoring the massive, exhausting physical history of her desperate survival. But in the completely new, massive timber addition, she aggressively installed a highly complex, completely modern, massively heavy motorized commercial extraction line, capable of completely processing thousands of incredibly heavy wax frames every single loud day. The incredibly small, completely dying coal town at the absolute bottom of the steep mountain was entirely, profoundly resurrected by the massive, heavy economic engine aggressively roaring at the top of the ridge. Harper heavily employed exactly 20 full-time, entirely local workers, paying them incredibly high, totally unshakable living wages that completely allowed them to fiercely rebuild their deeply ruined, highly desperate lives. The completely washed out, terrifying dirt track was now an incredibly busy, heavily maintained commercial road, totally buzzing with massive delivery trucks hauling incredibly heavy pallets of pure, glowing golden honey directly down to the massive cities. One incredibly hot, deeply humid, wildly blooming August afternoon, Harper sat entirely alone in the cool, quiet main room of the original heavy timber honey house. She was now 23 years old. The deeply terrified, completely broken, entirely starving girl who had aggressively bought the severely ruined liability for exactly $10 was completely permanently gone. She was an incredibly strong, deeply respected, highly masterful commercial beekeeper, completely fiercely in control of her massive, incredibly loud, totally thriving world. She walked slowly to the completely dark, heavily shadowed space entirely beneath the incredibly scarred oak workbench, She reached her heavily calloused, incredibly strong hands completely into the deep dark and grabbed the massive, incredibly heavy, permanently tarnished, solid copper bee smoke. She pulled the heavy copper vault completely out into the bright, soft afternoon sunlight, completely flooding through the massive open window. She popped the heavy copper lid completely off. The massive, thick, dark leather bags still sat entirely securely at the absolute bottom of the heavy cylinder. There were still exactly 300 completely pristine, incredibly massive solid gold coins remaining in the dark. It was still a massive, completely staggering, entirely unshakable physical fortune. But Harper did not feel any aggressive, desperate need to completely hoard the heavy gold. The massive, intense panic of terrifying, deep poverty was completely erased from her strong mind. She gently pulled the massive, incredibly fragile, thick, leather-bound diary completely out of its heavy waterproof canvas wrap. She carefully opened the heavy, deeply yellowed pages to the exact, heavily inked, fiercely underlined final paragraph left entirely by the dead, deeply heartbroken master beekeeper. Bees can only survive the winter if they know how to cluster close together. Harper smiled, a deep, profoundly peaceful, absolutely unshakable expression, entirely settling over her incredibly strong, deeply tanned face. She ran her heavy, deeply calloused fingers entirely over the faded black ink. She had completely, flawlessly fulfilled the massive, desperate, entirely heavy final request of the dying master. She had not completely frozen to death in the terrifying, deeply dark isolation. She had aggressively, completely conquered the freezing mountain. She had entirely resurrected the massive, silent timber room, bringing the incredibly loud, deeply vibrant, entirely unstoppable humming life completely back to the dead, ruined dirt. The heavy physical gold had merely been the massive, highly necessary, completely silent spark. The absolute, true, entirely permanent massive wealth was the fiercely loyal, entirely unbroken human hive she had aggressively built around the roaring cast-iron stove. The massive bees were completely safe, the heavily thriving town was entirely warm, and Harper was finally, completely, entirely home. As the massive, heavily buzzing commercial apiary on top of Blackwood Ridge aggressively entered its highly successful fifth completely unbroken year, the incredibly pure, profoundly dark wild mountain honey began to attract entirely unexpected, highly aggressive corporate attention. The deeply resonant, massive reputation of Harper's completely untouched, entirely organic operation had fiercely penetrated the sterile, loud boardrooms of the exact same massive agricultural conglomerates that had aggressively destroyed the valley decades ago. One heavily humid, highly oppressive Tuesday afternoon, a massive, incredibly expensive black luxury SUV aggressively crawled up the heavily maintained gravel road, coming to a loud, aggressive stop completely in the center of the sunny mountain clearing. 3 heavily dressed, highly intimidating corporate executives stepped aggressively out into the loud, buzzing air. They entirely ignored the massive, beautiful timber honey house, glaring aggressively at the perfectly aligned rows of hundreds of heavy white wooden hives. Harper walked slowly down from the massive new timber extension, her deeply calloused hands completely coated in sticky golden wax. She wiped her strong hands aggressively on her thick canvas pants, stopping exactly at the heavily scarred oak front door of the original building. She did not offer a completely polite greeting. She knew absolutely, exactly what the massive, loud suits entirely represented. The complete purity of your massive wild mountain operation is entirely unique in the completely saturated modern market, the lead executive stated aggressively, completely dispensing with any friendly introduction. My massive corporate board wants to completely acquire this entire mountain ridge. We will aggressively offer you exactly $2.5 million in completely clean cash today. We want to entirely bulldoze this decaying wooden structure, massively expand the clearing, and aggressively install 3,000 entirely synthetic, heavily medicated commercial hives. Harper did not flinch. She did not completely widen her dark eyes in profound shock at the incredibly massive, staggering sum of heavy cash. She stood completely entirely still, the incredibly loud, highly aggressive roar of 1,000,000 actively foraging honeybees heavily vibrating the hot mountain air completely around her. She thought immediately, aggressively, of the incredibly heavy, deeply yellowed leather diary entirely hidden in the dark. She vividly remembered the profoundly broken, deeply agonizing final words of the old master beekeeper, who had completely lost his massive, beautiful life's work to these exact, incredibly loud, totally ruthless corporate machines. They entirely viewed the highly complex, deeply beautiful superorganism exactly as they viewed cheap factory machines, as entirely disposable, highly exploitable, violently expendable, completely raw assets. "Absolutely not," Harper said, her voice dropping to a deeply cold, highly resonant, completely unyielding, massive rumble. The three corporate executives stared aggressively at the heavily muscled, entirely dirty young woman in complete, absolute disbelief. "You are completely failing to deeply understand the massive, incredible scale of this highly generous offer," the executive sneered aggressively, his face tightening with deep anger. "You are entirely operating a tiny, highly inefficient, completely primitive boutique farm out of a rotting wooden box. You cannot possibly completely survive a massive, aggressive modern market alone." Motum not entirely alone, Harper shot back aggressively, her dark eyes completely flashing with fierce, deeply protective fire. "And my highly complex bees are absolutely not your cheap, disposable corporate machines. You completely destroyed the entire valley below with your massive, highly toxic greed decades ago. You completely forced a master to hide in the dark. You are absolutely never, ever touching a single blade of thick grass on this massive mountain." Harper pointed a highly aggressive, deeply calloused finger directly toward the heavily graded, perfectly stable gravel road leading completely down the steep mountain. "Get entirely off my massive ridge," she commanded with absolute, fiercely terrifying, entirely unshakable authority. "Before Mort aggressively open the heavy wooden supers and completely introduce you to exactly how fiercely a massive, completely united hive violently protects its home." The corporate executives completely understood the profoundly violent, highly aggressive. They scrambled aggressively back into the massive luxury SUV and completely sped violently back down the steep mountain, leaving a massive, thick cloud of grey gravel dust completely hanging in the deeply buzzing, highly victorious summer air. Harper had completely permanently closed the massive circle. The incredibly beautiful, highly complex wild mountain was completely, absolutely safe. The highly aggressive, completely absolute rejection of the massive corporate buyout entirely solidified Harper's profound, incredibly deep, legendary status within the heavily revitalized, fiercely loyal coal town at the absolute bottom of the steep mountain. When the highly aggressive local rumors completely spread that she had entirely walked away from millions of corporate dollars explicitly to heavily protect the massive, pure mountain and their steady, incredibly high-paying jobs, the entirely grateful town completely transformed into an absolute, fiercely impenetrable wall of heavy protection around her. If any massive, unknown corporate vehicles even entirely attempted to slowly drive up the county road toward the steep dirt track, incredibly massive, heavy local logging trucks would accidentally completely break down, aggressively blocking the narrow road for highly frustrating hours. The town absolutely refused to completely let the highly toxic, entirely greedy modern world violently breach the deeply secure, incredibly thriving mountain sanctuary that had completely saved them all. As the incredibly long, highly productive years smoothly turned entirely into a completely peaceful, massively thriving decade, the massive, commercial apiary heavily evolved entirely beyond a simple single-owner business. Harper fiercely refused to entirely hoard the massive, overflowing agricultural wealth. She completely transformed the incredibly massive, highly profitable operation into a highly secure, completely equal worker-owned cooperative. The two incredibly strong, heavily quiet ex-miners who had completely helped her violently clear the massive brush during her incredibly difficult first expansion were now entirely, deeply respected full partners, fiercely managing entirely massive sections of the highly complex mountain apiary. The terrified 19-year-old girl who had entirely fled a violent home was now a highly educated, deeply masterful commercial entomologist, entirely managing the deeply complex, highly vital queen rearing program in the completely secure back timber room. The incredibly massive, heavily buzzing operation completely thrived entirely on absolute, deeply forged mutual trust, entirely mirroring the incredibly profound, highly complex, massively synchronized behavior of the heavily humming hives they so deeply tended. They were an absolutely completely unshakable, fiercely loyal, deeply integrated human superorganism. Inside the completely original, deeply revered heavy timber honey house, the incredibly massive, completely antique stainless steel radial extractor still entirely dominated the absolute center of the deeply oiled wooden floor. The massive, heavily sealed, solid copper smoker still sat completely untouched entirely beneath the incredibly scarred oak workbench in the dark back corner. The heavy, dark leather bags completely filled with pristine, heavy solid gold coins had absolutely not been touched in entirely over 7 highly prosperous years. The massive, completely unshakable cooperative did not entirely need the deeply hidden, emergency wealth anymore. The incredibly heavy, pure gold was no longer a deeply desperate, highly necessary lifeline against agonizing starvation. It was now entirely preserved as a massive, highly potent, completely permanent physical symbol. It was a deeply silent, incredibly heavy reminder of the profound, absolutely critical importance of complete, massive resilience. The heavy gold had completely saved the terrified, utterly broken 20-year-old girl from entirely freezing to death in the deeply terrifying dark. It had aggressively bought the massive steel roof beams and the deeply vital, highly commercial gravel road. But Harper knew with absolute fierce certainty that if the heavy, highly hidden gold were somehow entirely, completely stolen tomorrow, the massive, highly thriving apiary would completely, entirely survive without missing a single incredibly productive bee. The true, absolute, completely indestructible wealth was entirely, deeply ingrained in the heavily calloused, fiercely capable hands of the entirely loyal town, and heavily vibrating in the millions of fiercely protective, perfectly synchronized wings entirely surrounding the massive timber honey house. The mountain was entirely awake, completely safe, and profoundly, fiercely alive. The brutal, incredibly freezing, deeply dark Pennsylvania winter entirely returned to the massive isolated peak of Blackwood Ridge, explicitly covering the hundreds of perfectly aligned heavy wooden hives in incredibly thick, heavy, completely silent blankets of pristine white snow. The completely massive, deeply terrifying, aggressive mountain cold violently pushed the temperature to absolute, deeply dangerous sub-zero extremes, heavily freezing the incredibly loud, completely rushing mountain spring entirely solid. But entirely inside the massively fortified, incredibly thick walls of the heavily restored timber honey house, the completely terrifying, deeply agonizing threat of freezing death was absolutely, completely non-existent. The incredible, massive cast-iron wood stove aggressively roared in the deeply open main room, violently pushing massive, incredibly intense, deeply radiant orange heat completely against the highly insulated, heavily sealed wooden walls. The massive long room was completely filled with the incredibly loud, deeply joyful, entirely warm sounds of massive human connection. The highly exhausted, entirely grateful worker cooperative had completely gathered inside the warm, deeply fragrant timber building to aggressively celebrate the absolute, highly successful completion of their incredibly massive, totally record-breaking autumn honey harvest. Loud, aggressive laughter completely echoed entirely off the incredibly thick, highly varnished cedar ceiling beam. The heavily scarred, completely massive oak workbench was entirely covered with incredibly large, steaming platters of deeply rich, hot-roasted meat and massive, heavy loaves of thick, fresh bread, heavily slathered in completely raw, incredibly sweet mountain honey. The two highly quiet, fiercely strong ex-miners were actively, aggressively arguing with deep, profound smiles over highly complex, incredibly minute queen-rearing genetics with the fiercely confident, completely brilliant young entomologist. Harper sat entirely quietly in a massive, deeply worn leather chair completely near the violently roaring bright orange fire. She was 30 years old now. The incredibly deep, agonizing, completely terrifying trauma of the massive human betrayal that had violently driven her completely up the terrifying, washed-out mountain was completely, permanently healed. The deep, heavy physical scars on her completely strong hands were fiercely proud, highly visible testaments to her incredibly brutal, deeply successful battle for absolute, completely unyielding survival. She looked deeply into the bright, intensely dancing orange flames, entirely listening to the beautiful, highly chaotic, completely warm human noise aggressively filling the massive room. She thought entirely of the highly terrifying, deeply isolating, completely freezing first winter she had violently suffered on this exact same thick wooden floor. She vividly, deeply remembered completely pulling her thin, starving knees to her shivering chest, totally convinced that complete, absolute, deeply impenetrable human isolation was her only entirely safe paix-à-terre entirely forward. She had been completely, profoundly, entirely wrong. She completely closed her dark eyes, violently pushing her deeply expanded, highly attuned awareness entirely outside the massively thick timber walls, directly into the completely freezing, highly dangerous, perfectly silent dark snow. Inside the hundreds of incredibly heavy, highly insulated white wooden boxes completely dotting the massive clearing, the incredibly loud, highly aggressive summer hum was entirely completely silent. The massive, incredibly complex superorganism was absolutely not completely dead. Deeply inside the absolute, completely dark center of every single heavy wooden hive, tens of thousands of highly dedicated, fiercely strong honeybees were aggressively, tightly clustering completely together. They were actively, violently vibrating their incredibly powerful, heavy flight muscles, aggressively generating an incredibly massive, highly intense, deeply localized pocket of entirely life-saving, completely vital heat around their precious queen. Bees can only survive the winter if they know how to cluster close together. The profound, incredibly heavy, completely beautiful truth violently settled completely into her deeply peaceful, entirely unshakable soul. She completely opened her dark eyes and looked entirely around the massively warm, loudly laughing, fiercely loyal room. She had completely entirely found her massive, heavily protective cluster. She had aggressively built her own incredibly warm, fiercely united human hive, completely ensuring that the heavy, terrified, entirely isolated 20-year-old girl would completely never, ever freeze in the brutal dark again. The incredibly massive, heavily buzzing apiary completely sitting on the absolute towering peak of Blackwood Ridge eventually became entirely vastly more than a highly successful, deeply profitable commercial agricultural enterprise. The fully restored, incredibly massive, heavy timber honey house transformed completely into a highly vital, deeply profound, entirely unshakable symbol of absolute, fierce resilience for the entirely resurrected coal town, completely nestled in the dark valley below. Harper fiercely, completely maintained her highly rigid, absolutely unyielding commitment to the deeply slow, highly meticulous, entirely pure craft. She absolutely, completely refused to ever use aggressive, highly toxic chemical varroamite treatments, entirely relying on deeply complex, highly advanced, purely genetic resistance breeding programs heavily managed by the fiercely brilliant, completely dedicated young entomologist. She absolutely refused to completely supplement the massive winter food stores with cheap, highly refined industrial sugar syrup, aggressively insisting that the massively strong hives explicitly retain a completely massive, heavy surplus of their own highly nutritious, deeply complex wild honey. Because of these highly expensive, incredibly labor-intensive, deeply ethical choices, the raw, incredibly dark mountain honey remained completely, absolutely flawless. It was aggressively highly sought after entirely by top-tier culinary experts completely across the entire massive country, commanding incredibly high, heavily premium prices that entirely, completely guaranteed the massive, fiercely loyal worker cooperative would entirely remain complete, profoundly financially secure for absolute massive generations to come. On a deeply quiet, completely crisp, highly beautiful late October afternoon, precisely as the massive, heavy green pine trees aggressively gave way to the completely violently explosive, deeply rich red and gold colors of the turning autumn leaves, Harper walked entirely alone out into the completely massive, heavily buzzing clearing. The incredible massive summer nectar flow was completely over, but the hundreds of heavily populated, highly defensive hives were actively, aggressively, completely busy, deeply sealing the massive wooden frames with thick, heavy layers of completely pure, white beeswax, fiercely preparing for the coming deep freeze. The massive, deeply resonant, highly rhythmic hum vibrating entirely through the crisp mountain air was entirely different from the frantic, incredibly aggressive roar of the midsummer bee. It was a deeply steady, highly organized, completely profound sound of massive, intense preparation and heavy, absolute security. She walked slowly to the absolute edge of the deeply cleared ridge, looking entirely down at the massive, sprawling valley below. She could completely see the tiny, neatly repaired brick buildings of the heavily thriving town, the massive, perfectly graded gravel road completely snaking its entirely safe, highly reliable path directly up the incredibly steep, heavily forested mountain. She had aggressively completely conquered the terrifying, deeply ruined dirt. The severely condemned, highly rotting $10 timber liability was entirely permanently gone, completely replaced by an absolutely unbreakable, deeply fortified, highly productive sanctuary, entirely dedicated to the massive, complex preservation of beautiful, completely pure life. She turned completely around and slowly faced the massive, deeply beautiful, heavily oiled structure of the completely restored timber honey house. She heavily felt the absolute, profound weight of the incredible, deeply massive journey. From the entirely broken, violently betrayed, completely terrified, deeply starving girl sleeping aggressively on the hard, freezing floorboards, to the fiercely strong, completely masterful, deeply loved leader of a massive, heavily vibrating, entirely completely unshakable human hive. She did not entirely need the hidden, heavy solid gold completely sealed inside the massive copper smoker anymore.